eco-museums and imagine the world through eco-museums. Thank you for this. Our next speaker is Rémi Gandoin. Rémi is a civil engineer. He studied in France and in Denmark, and has been working in the wind energy industry in Denmark since 2009. To better understand his engineering practice and potentially improve it, he maintains the website iolians.net, where he is building a genealogy of wind and site studies, a subfield of wind energy traditionally less historized than wind turbine design. Rémi, thank you for joining us today. The digital podium is yours. Then we will continue with our questions, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me, bring up the pointer. All right. Well, I'm very pleased to be speaking before a wonderful audience today. And in this presentation, I will let you know about my project, which is called eolians.net, which has brought to me a lot as an engineer in wind energy. So in this presentation, I have chosen to tell you about, first of all, who I am and what I do for a living, but also what I do on my free time, which is this eolians.net project. And I will focus on two papers. One of them is already published, and it will serve as an introduction to the project. And the other one is a paper in the making, where I explore a particular aspect of wind and site studies that are my field of practice as an engineer. And lastly, I would like to open up possibly for a discussion with yourself on how engineering practitioners could contribute to doing environmental history of technology, either ways talking to and with historians. So moving on to who am I and what I do. So I'm 37 years old, I'm French, been living in Denmark since 2007, and I'm an engineer in offshore wind. So building offshore wind turbines. I have a background in my practice is about geosciences, meteorology, oceanography, and structural mechanics, because after all, we are building these structures made of steel. And in particular, I'm working a lot with something called wind and site studies, which are engineering questions related to the wind, of course, and how strong is the wind, and at a given location, and how turbulent is it. And then when I have this information, so how many turbines should I place at a given site, and which type, and where should I place them? Also answering questions like, well, how much energy will the turbines produce over the next 1, 5, 20 years? And when they do produce something, because they do, why is it that they don't produce what we expect? All sorts of questions related, as you can see, to wind farms. And designing wind farms, it will be my point during the presentation, not the same as designing wind turbines. So my focus is on designing wind farms. And you could say that if from a very high level perspective, engineers like me very much appreciate the next big thing. Okay, so here is a new wind project, there I go, you know. And while we acknowledge that there are existing wind farms and stuff that we have done in the past, the stuff that we have done long time ago, meaning like typically more than 5 years ago, is not so much to talk about. At the same time, I've always had an interest for, you know, history and, you know, basically archives and things like this. And I'm often tempted maybe to not pay so much attention to the next big thing, but look at the previous next big thing and the things that we used to do maybe in the past. So I've always been wanted to basically make a history of my field of practice, which I knew was possible to do, but didn't really exist. And you may question me on that, because you may come back to me and ask, okay, Rémi, why is it that you say that? Because after all, there is much information on the internet about wind energy. You look at all those books, okay? And that's fair. Actually, these books are very interesting. And they answer questions like, Why is it that they all come from Denmark, these wind turbines? Why do they have 3 blades? Why do they point towards the wind? And how did they get so big? And what a wonderful thing, you know, we just love those machines and stuff. So there's really a lot of literature on the actual turbine design. But I think it's fair to say, in particular in a conference like this one, that wind energy is of course more than wind turbines. And I think that scholars like Mariana would know that very well, that you know, yeah, we know it's more than wind turbines. There's also policy, there's regulatory, there's landscapes, there's communities, there's imaginaries that really are different between fossil fuels and renewable energies, and all of it being, you know, grasped by the idea that technology isn't neutral, by the way. So I'm very much aware of the literature that exists, I believe, on those topics. Yet, when I look from a personal perspective, a technical perspective on these aspects, I couldn't find anything on my practice. Because, like I said at first, my practice resides in not designing wind turbines, but designing wind farms. And that's really another thing. And so I went on and started to build up what I called a genealogy of wind and site studies, which became basically a collection of documents that I pull up on the internet, together with a website, like a blog, which is called eolians.net. And on that blog, I'm storing a lot of documents, but also I'm writing about these documents like a librarian would do, or an archivist would do, and, you know, take out some of the stuff from the archive and write about it. And I've did that for maybe a couple of years, and maybe, I don't know, it was around 2016, 17, I started that. And that led me to basically being able, and that was quite satisfying for me to say, okay, fine, here is a well-known timeline of wind turbine history. Maybe if you're not into wind turbines, that doesn't speak to you, but if you want to get into wind turbines history, you quickly get to this kind of timeline where you start all the way back in 1940 and even before that, and come today with the largest turbines that we have that are 200-meter high and stuff like that. And this is really cool and interesting. So I have that timeline, and this actually had it before. What I added with my genealogy, it's all the stuff that wasn't talked about, the stuff I do. Measuring the wind, modeling the wind, figuring out how much the turbines will produce, etc., etc. And this is what I call wind and site history. And it turns out that it's, of course, has much interaction with the wind turbine design, of course. I mean, these are my colleagues, basically. But we have different specialties. And basically, once I reached this point, I was then able to say, look, it's quite satisfying, because here is a timeline that actually reflects what I see every day at the office. Fine, here are the documents, and people can go and fetch them if they want to. That was still not super satisfying, because at the end of the day, when you have a genealogy, is to do what, you know? So I went on and decided to clarify this for myself, and wrote this article, which is not an article, but which is basically an interpellation in the beautiful Journal of Energy History, where I come and I say, well, look, this is what I did, and this is why I'm doing it, kind of thing. So I focused on 3 different questions that I thought were worth analyzing from a maybe historical perspective. One of them was, are these studies necessary to doing proper wind turbine design? The second was, once I have talked a lot about these wind and site studies, what are they in real? And I take the example of something that's called wind energy meteorology, and I try to characterize the subfield here and try to discuss it and try to explain what it is. And the last section of the paper is kind of an opening towards people like yourselves, in scholars in humanities, and say, okay, so now that we have tried to draw the contours of this field, of wind site studies, a subfield of wind energy, can we then explain how the field starts affecting other stuff, like, for example, the way people perceive their landscape, the way people understand the wind as a resource? Maybe did it feed anything back to meteorology as a whole, kind of thing, you know? So that's the kind of openings I was making in this paper. And I was very lucky to have it reviewed by a leading scholar in wind energy history, also energy history, Matthias Heymann from Aarhus University. And you can find his review here if you're curious. And that has something that has helped me a lot into figuring out what the next steps would be. And another thing that I thought was great, something great that happened in my life, it's the publication of this article by Mariana this year, or last year, sorry, where she actually went and did some really good job as an historian into one specific aspect of the wind site studies that I knew slightly about, but I didn't have the time and the possibility and the skills to analyze in detail. And this kind of article, for example, deals with, in this case, a post-war Britain wind measurement campaign, just to understand, you know, basically sitting in London and thinking, is there wind out there? You know, and people in the Orkneys know that there is wind out there, but maybe not everyone in London knows that. So they went out and measured awful amount of places, in particular on tops of Scottish hills, the wind conditions. And it's very interesting because it gives so much depth to start reflecting about, like, okay, so the Brits did that, how did the Danes do? And how come then, if the Brits did that, well, how come there is no wind energy industry in Britain today, and why are all turbines coming from Denmark, kind of thing? And that is an article that I really liked. So you could say that it really led me to thinking, okay, Rémi, now you maybe should take a step forward and maybe write your own article as well, and try it out. So that would be the focus of part 2 of the presentation. Before that, I just wanted to share a picture with you to explain a little bit, because it will serve as a transition towards the part 2. So what you see here we are somewhere in the US, in California, in the 1980s, and you see two people that are measuring the wind. It's a very 1980s picture, right? I mean, the van, the colors and everything. And one of them has a kite measuring the wind speed, I guess. And the other one has like a met mast with some anemometer here. And these guys are consultants. And they are not making wind turbines, right? But they work in wind energy. And the kind of work they do, it's the kind of work I do, actually. It's something that emerged with the industrialization of the wind energy and the switch from the wind turbine design manufacturer kind of focus to the focus on the wind turbine owner, the project developer. Because when you start having wind turbines out there that you can buy, you know, they're more or less off the shelf, then you start wondering, well, where do I put them? And who's going to pay for that? And typically that's the picture of like what you have today on a given wind energy project, where you have like a site, some nice mountain somewhere where you want to put wind turbines. And then you have like all of the people who can provide stuff, including wind turbines. But then you have the project owner, and the project owner needs help. And he needs help to understand the site, so technical perspective, but also he needs help to do the mediation with other stakeholders. And these guys, like the consultants here, are the ones that you saw on the picture before, and they are the ones I want to write about, because that's actually my work today, and has been my work in many years. So my paper, which is in the making, I'm planning to talk about them. And over the period 1980, 1999, so that means from the very beginning of the industry to a moment where the industry has matured to a good extent. And the paper will talk about two things. It will set the focus on the wind turbine owner, wind turbine project developer. So move away from wind turbine design and move on to like wind farms. And then it's going to talk about these actors that are consultants as mediators, you could say, in the wind energy market. So their practice is both influenced by the market, but they also influence the market by their practice, right? So this is the kind of stuff I'm working with. So two different markets. One of them is Denmark, the other one is the US. And I work with a number of consultancies. There are two small Danish consultancies, one English consultant that became later on actually the global leader. And by the way, they are headquartered in Bristol. Then one large American consultancy, and then a lot of small ones over there. And all of these people, I kind of trying to map them and describe what they did and who they were using a number of different sources. And these sources are conferences, workshop papers, company archives, if I have them, very rare, brochures, old websites, newspaper articles, oral testimonies and interviews or emails that I'm writing to people, and personal archives and data. And each of these sources, they have pros and cons. I guess you know more than this about me, than me, sorry. But I'm the point now where I think I have enough to start writing, but I'm not sure I have enough. So I'm struggling a little bit to figure out, am I missing a big piece of the puzzle, yes or no? But at some point I need to crack on and start writing. So let's see. But this is about, you know, my basically rough methodology slash sources. The paper will look like that. The paper will have an introduction, of course, and then it will have 3 descriptive parts following chronologically different moments of wind energy in the recent history. The first part will focus on Denmark and California at the time where there were 2 independent markets, more or less, for consultants. And then I look into, you know, what they did, who they were, things in common, things that differ. Part 2 is going to be about like the transition period between those local markets to a more global industry. And this is where you see the emergence of that British-based, Bristol-based consultancy company, and also others. And the third part will be like at the time where in the late 90s, where the industry started to have like a design standards, certification schemes, etc., where you had a blossoming of the consultant market all of a sudden, because basically you couldn't build a project without having a bank backing you up, and the bank needed consultants to tell them whether it was wise or not to build a project. And that was also the case, for example, for like, you know, buying turbines and stuff. So blossoming of the consultant market, but at the same time, still some variety in the practice. And the discussion will then take those 3 parts and talk about 3 questions. So the first one, I will come back to that thing that says, is it necessary to do wind insight studies to do wind energy? By the way, no one's talking about it, right? Everyone's talking about the wind turbine, but there's a lot of people doing wind insight studies. And the question is it really necessary? And of course, like spoiler, yes, it is, but why? And then second question, try to understand those consultants within the wind energy market. So why is it they do the things they do? What were they thinking? Kind of like try to understand really these actors within the market and see, did they have any effect on the industry, and if yes, in what way? And then a more like sociotech kind of discussion where I go and say, okay, they were sitting somewhere in the US, somewhere in Denmark. They were facing the same problems, yet they came up with different solutions, most likely because of the distance and the fact that they could not communicate and exchange technology as quick as we can do today. But it's a nice benchmark. It's a nice way to analyze these kind of things. They really had different technologies, right? So it was interesting to figure this out. Like, for example, the kite thing, no one did the kite thing in Denmark. I mean, just children do that, okay? But in California, they went on and did a lot of kiting, right? So to measure the wind. So that was interesting. Moving on to my challenges. Of course, I'm no historian, okay? So it's difficult for me, all of that. So I have quite some good books about like consulting engineers, but most of them were written by consulting engineering firms, you know. So it's a bit like, you know, yeah, self how to say, appreciative. So if any of you have good tips on consulting engineers history, I'd like to take them. On the sociotech part, I have this really nice book, really beautiful book from Martin Mahoney, where he talks about imaginaries, technical imaginaries, weather and climate. And I'm going to take a lot of inspiration from that book. Actually, I don't know if you know it. It's really nice. Let me just conclude the presentation by just letting you know what I think are the challenges of working with engineers and historians on those topics. So maybe you have tried to work with engineers. If you came to us and told us about your research in history of technology, or we would most likely start complaining about the fact that you have forgotten to talk about our work. Because historians typically have the bigger picture, and they say things like, well, if it was not you, it would have been someone else, right? Because there was some moment of technological history where things emerge, and it can be A or B, a person, it doesn't matter so much. But at the end of the day, still, engineers like to make sure that they are being acknowledged. On the other hand, historians, in my opinion, okay, have a tendency to focus sometime on really radical design, stuff that no one had done before, or like here we come and make a wave energy device or something like that. Yet it's really not the most common thing to do as an engineer. I mean, engineers don't do that for a living most of the time. I mean, 95% of engineering work is normal design. And maybe if you know this, maybe you don't. But there's one book in particular that I recommend for people who want to discuss engineering studies. It's this one from Walter Vincenti, published in the early 90s, as a response to the other book from the people of the social construction of technological systems. And my take on it is that it's hard to do both at the same time, to be a historian and an engineer. However, it's possible to try and understand each other and possibly agree on some common basis for discussion, which are like, facts. So happy to discuss about that more if you want to, but just to wrap up my talk today. So I hope I've convinced you that wind energy technology is more than wind turbine technology. That, for example, you have wind insight studies. There are other things as well. And I hope to have showed you and clearly enough my experience as a non-historian trying to historicize the field of practice by first doing the genealogy and then realizing that it's maybe not enough and trying to produce analytical work, which is the hard part that I'm still working with. And since I'm still working with that and constantly, chatting with people about this, I'll be happy to receive any questions, first of all, you may have, or any feedback you may have for me today. And on these words, I will end the presentation and maybe pick it up later if we need so.